The gods made one fatal mistake. They trusted Loki. He wasn't fully god. He wasn't fully giant. He was something else entirely. A shapeshifter, a deceiver, a force of pure chaos who had somehow convinced Odin himself to become his blood brother. His tricks ranged from harmless pranks to schemes that could tear the 9 realms apart. But one morning, Loki crossed a line that would change everything. He cut off the golden hair of Sif while she slept. Thor's wife, the goddess whose radiant hair symbolized the harvest itself. When Thor discovered what had happened, his fury shook the foundations of Asgard. He seized Loki by the throat, ready to end him right there. Loki, choking and desperate, made a promise. He would replace the hair with something even greater. This is the story of how Loki's crime gave the gods their greatest weapons and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the end of the world. Loki fled to Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen whose skill with metal and magic surpassed anything in the 9 realms. He found the sons of Ivaldi, legendary smiths whose forge burned hotter than any volcano. He explained his predicament, and they agreed to help. What they created went beyond anything Loki had imagined. First, they forged hair from pure gold, not mere decoration, but living strands that would root themselves in Sif's scalp and grow naturally. But they didn't stop there. They crafted Gungnir, a spear that never missed its target, destined to become Odin's most feared weapon. They built Skidbladnir, a ship so brilliantly designed it could fold into a pocket, yet unfold large enough to carry every god in Asgard, and it always sailed with favorable winds. Loki, impressed with himself and never knowing when to quit, made a wager with 2 other dwarven brothers, Brokkr and Sindri. He bet his own head that they couldn't forge 3 items to match what the sons of Ivaldi had made. The brothers accepted. Sindri worked the forge while Brokkr manned the bellows, but Loki, realizing he might actually lose this bet, transformed into a fly and tried to sabotage them. As they forged the first creation, Loki bit down hard on Brokkr's hand. Blood ran down the dwarf's arm, but he never stopped working the bellows. From the flames emerged Gulenbursti, a boar with golden bristles that could race faster than any horse across land, sea, and sky, glowing bright enough to turn night into day. For the second item, Loki bit Brokkr's neck, tearing flesh. The dwarf grunted in pain, but held steady. They produced Draupnir, a golden ring that would spawn 8 identical rings every 9th night. Infinite wealth forever. For the final creation, as Sindri shaped what would become the mightiest weapon ever forged, Loki bit Brokkr's eyelid. Blood poured into the dwarf's eyes, blinding him. For just a heartbeat, Brokkr's grip on the bellows faltered. When they pulled the finished work from the forge, it was Mjolnir, the hammer that would make Thor a legend. But because of that single moment of hesitation, the handle came out slightly too short. Not quite right for 2 hands, barely perfect for 1. The gods gathered to judge the contest. Sif received her golden hair and was restored. Odin claimed Gungnir and Draupnir. Freyr took Gulenbursti and Skidbladnir for his journeys between realms, and Thor received Mjolnir. Despite its imperfect handle, the gods declared it the greatest treasure of all. Why? Because Mjolnir alone could defend Asgard from the endless giant armies that threatened their existence. Brokkr and Sindri had won. They demanded Loki's head. Loki, ever the trickster, agreed, but with one condition. They could take his head, but not 1 inch of his neck, because that wasn't part of the wager. Unable to separate head from neck without violating the bargain, the furious dwarves settled for sewing Loki's mouth shut with leather cords, silencing his silver tongue, at least for a while. Thor wielded Mjolnir like an extension of his own rage. The hammer always returned to his hand after being thrown, no matter the distance. It could shrink small enough to hide beneath his shirt, then expand to full size in an instant. When Thor gripped it and struck, thunder rolled across the heavens and lightning split the sky. He rode into battle in a chariot pulled by 2 goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjost. Each night he would slaughter and feast on them. Each morning he would lay their bones inside their hides and consecrate them with Mjolnir, resurrecting them fully healed. Thor made constant war on the giants, journey after journey into Jotunheim, the frozen land of his enemies, and the giants feared him for good reason. One of Thor's most legendary battles came when the giant Hrungnir, drunk on mead and arrogance, boasted that he would storm Asgard, slaughter every god, and drag Freya and Sif back to Jotunheim as trophies. Thor challenged him to single combat. They met at a place called Griotunagardar. Hrungnir was colossal even among giants, and his heart was literal stone, sharp-edged and unbreakable. He carried a stone shield and wielded a massive whetstone as his weapon. Before Thor arrived, his servant Thjalfi ran ahead and tricked Hrungnir into standing on his shield rather than holding it, claiming Thor would attack from below ground. When Thor appeared, racing forward with Mjolnir raised high, lightning crackling around him like a living storm, Hrungnir hurled his whetstone with all his monstrous strength. The two weapons met in midair. The impact cracked the sky itself. The whetstone shattered into 1,000 fragments, one massive shard embedding itself deep in Thor's forehead. But Mjolnir continued its arc, smashing through Hrungnir's stone skull and dropping the giant dead instantly. Hrungnir collapsed forward, one of his massive legs pinning Thor to the ground. None of the gods could lift it. Finally, Thor's 3-year-old son Magni arrived, born of the giantess Jarnsaxa. The boy gripped his grandfather's leg and lifted it with ease, displaying strength that surpassed even his father's at that age. Thor gifted Magni with Hrungnir's horse, though Odin grumbled that such a prize should have been his. The whetstone fragment remained lodged in Thor's skull forever. A sorceress named Groa tried to remove it with magic, chanting spells that slowly worked it loose. But Thor, excited it was working, told her he had once rescued her long-lost husband from the frozen rivers of Jotunheim. He mentioned carrying him in a basket, and that one of the man's toes had frozen solid, so Thor snapped it off and flung it into the heavens, where it became a star. Groa was so overwhelmed with joy that her husband was alive that she forgot the rest of her spell. The stone remained embedded in Thor's head as a permanent scar. Another time, Thor journeyed to Jotunheim with Loki, seeking glory in battle. They came to a towering castle ruled by Utgard Loki, a giant king of immense cunning. He welcomed them, but mocked their strength, challenging them to prove themselves worthy of his hospitality. Thor, confident and proud, accepted. First, Utgard Loki handed Thor a drinking horn, a test of endurance. Thor drank in massive gulps, draining what should have emptied the largest vessel. But when he lowered the horn, the level had barely dropped. He was humiliated. Next, Utgard Loki challenged him to lift his cat, a simple test. Thor strained with every ounce of divine strength and could only barely lift one of the cat's paws off the ground. Finally, as a final insult, the giant king offered to let Thor wrestle his elderly nursemaid, Ellie. Thor grappled with the frail old woman, using every technique he knew, every measure of his godly power. Slowly, inevitably, she forced him to one knee. He couldn't defeat her. Humiliated and seething, Thor and his companions prepared to leave. But as they passed through the gates, Utgard Loki called out and revealed the truth. It had all been illusion, magic designed to test them beyond what they thought possible. The drinking horn had been connected to the ocean itself. Thor's drinking had lowered sea levels across the world, creating the tides. The cat had been Jormungandr, the World Serpent, a creature so vast it wrapped around all of Midgard. That Thor had lifted even one paw was a feat unmatched in history. And Ellie, the old woman, she was old age itself, the only force that defeats all living things eventually. Thor had done better against these opponents than anyone ever had. Enraged at being deceived, Thor raised Mjolnir to obliterate Utgard Loki and his castle. But they vanished, in illusion dissolved, leaving only empty plains. But Thor's greatest enemy wasn't any giant he could strike down. It was Jormungandr. The World Serpent was one of 3 monstrous children born to Loki and the giantess Angrboda. The others were Fenrir, a wolf growing more savage each day, and Hel, a daughter half living and half corpse. When prophecies warned that these children would bring catastrophe, Odin had them dragged before him. He cast Hel into the deepest darkness beneath the World Tree, where she became ruler of the dishonored dead in the realm of Helheim. He seized Jormungandr and hurled the serpent into the ocean surrounding Midgard, thinking it would drown. Instead, it fed. It devoured whales, ships, anything that moved in the water. It grew larger and larger until it stretched around the entire world, finally grasping its own tail in its jaws. Fenrir remained in Asgard, but his growth terrified the gods. Only Tyr, the god of war and justice, was brave enough to approach the beast. Loki's crime had given the gods their most powerful weapons, but his children would become their doom. Thor had Mjolnir, Odin had Gungnir. The gods had never been stronger, but the prophecies were clear. One day, Fenrir would break free. Jormungandr would rise from the ocean, and Loki himself would lead the armies of the dead against Asgard. The gods had everything they needed to defend themselves. It wouldn't be enough.